Hello, welcome to the In My Beach Boys Room podcast. My name is Adam Schreiner. I'm here with Matthew Hartz. I am considered the casual Beach Boys fan in this situation, and Matthew is our Beach Boys enthusiast, expert, Beach Boy nut, whatever adjective you want to use in that situation to describe someone who just has studied and loves the Beach Boys. So, Matthew, I have a question for you today, and that is, how did this all get started? How did the Beach Boys get started? From the beginning?
Okay. Yeah. So are you aware of the fact that the Beach Boys are primarily a family?
Yeah, and I mean, that's in fact that is just what I assume in my head is that they are all a family. Like
No,
every member? No, not the case.
No. So let me get into that just a little bit. The family relationship. The three Wilson brothers, Brian, Dennis, and Carl, their father, Murray, had a sister named Glee, or Emily. I believe they called her Glee, but her name is Emily. And her son, one of her sons, she had three sons and I think three daughters, is Mike Love, who's a first cousin to the three Wilson brothers.
Okay, first cousin to the three Wilson brothers. That's four.
Yeah. Well, and so we have to start there for a while because for a long time, both the Wilson and the Love families were musical families. Murray had been raised in kind of a musical family along with, of course, his sister. And they both had a love of music and they wanted to pass it on. You know, in a way, I guess they were a lot more like traditional American families back then. A lot more families would play music together, you know, in earlier times.
Sure.
You know? So maybe they weren't that out of the ordinary, but they were definitely passionate about music. And so they carried it on with their children. And what they would do is they would have family get-togethers, even when the kids were really little, and famously around Christmas time. And they would get together and have sing-alongs, and some of the kids would do individual performances. Mike talks a lot about Brian sitting on his grandma's knee singing Danny Boy at a very, very young age and just fracturing everybody, you know. Mm-hmm. And so they had these get-togethers, and then as an extension of that, Brian and Mike, especially because they were about the same age, they'd get together after the get-togethers and listen to popular music of the day, like the rock and roll and stuff like that, sing Everly Brothers tunes, the doo-wop stuff of the day. And so they were, you know, also kind of, you know, when they got a little bit older, they were starting to branch out and do that stuff. But so as a family, as an extended family, they were already singing and playing music together. And in the Wilson home, especially Murray and Audrey were both really, you know, passionate about music and both keyboard players. And there was always music going on in the home. And all three Wilson brothers were exposed to it very early and taught to sing very early, you know, or started singing very early. And so that in itself, just having a family unit that plays and sings together is a big part of where we are with the basic unit that is the Beach Boys.
Sure, yeah. I mean, especially in the size of extended family as well, not just the immediate family, you know.
Right, not just the
Wilsons, but the Loves that extends that far.
Yeah. Mike's sisters, or one sister played harp and is actually on In My Room and Catch a Wave on the Surfer Girl album, playing harp on an actual Beach Boys record, so that another cousin's the fun, you know, early on. So they just played music. They were all into music, heavy duty, you know. Brian and Carl started becoming involved with groups at school singing and stuff, mainly together, but I think individually too. And a lot of different little groups and formations they did with classmates and stuff like that. Then we bring a friend into the equation, and the friend is Al Jardine. And he was going to school with Brian at Hawthorne High. And he was in a lot of folk groups independently. He had started to learn to play music as a teenager and become very interested in music. And Al and Brian got to know each other in high school, famously being on the football team together a little bit, but not really. They would talk about getting together every once in a while, but from what I understand, it really wasn't until they graduated from Hawthorne High School that a few months after that, Al approached Brian and said, basically we've been talking about let's get together and do something. Mm-hmm. And so that really, it was the friend outside of the family that, kind of pushed that first little spark of
interesting. Okay.
Getting those guys together. Yeah.
So then we have a friend, we have a family and then a friend, outsider friend come in, and that's kind of the initial kind of blend of everything coming together.
Right. And Al makes mention of the fact that he had seen Brian and Carl play together at school and was impressed.
Okay.
And Brian heard Al do some of his stuff with his groups, and so they're kind of checking each other out, right? It's almost like being in, it is sort of like being in rival bands, always looking, ooh, that'd be fun to make music with that guy, or something, one of those types of deals. So he was aware of them and impressed, and they had separate deals going on. And so, but he was the one that was proactive enough to say, hey, let's get together and do something.
Okay. So then he, gets them together. So then how do you go from just like, hey, let's jam or let's play some music to essentially the Beach Boys, right?
Right. Well, the singing, I think, is the thing that came first. I mean, Brian had been, we haven't talked any about Brian's development as a musician in this episode very much, but basically it came from studying these 4 Freshman records that he was really into. And so the first part of that getting together was getting Al and Carl and Mike. Dennis, not really at this point. They were singing 4 Freshman arrangements of songs and stuff like that. So not a whole lot instrument based. Probably Brian at the piano and all them singing around that. Maybe Carl on the guitar. Carl had started learning guitar at around the 11 or 12, maybe a little bit before that. I need to check dates exactly on, but Carl had been playing the guitar, and the neighborhood kid, David Marks, who was a couple years younger than Carl, was learning to play guitar right along with him, and that comes in later in the story. But when they get together, Carl, which is funny because he's like 15 at this time, he's the only one that's really officially any sort of a kind of a musician really to begin with, other than Brian studying, getting keyboard information from his parents, and also studying these 4 Freshman jazz records that gave him this insane piano type knowledge.
So we have Carl, who is kind of the only, like you said, the only
he had been the guy taking lessons.
Okay, so he's practicing music. You have Brian, who's kind of teaching himself through the 4 freshmen.
Yeah, and also really Brian got some accordion lessons very early on when he was very young. But I think most of his early piano knowledge comes from his mother and father.
Okay,
and
they taught him how to,
stuff. Yes, and more than just your basic, they learn some cool stuff and stuff that they wouldn't have learned in another particular type of education, right? Okay. So he had, and actually all of the boys, I think at that point, Dennis included, who's not in the group, right, or he probably was on a peripheral
as a brother
level. Yeah, well, and occasionally doing it, but not seriously at the beginning.
Sure. So you have Carl, Brian, and then Al, Al and Mike at this point. Mm-hmm. Okay. So then where do we go from here?
Okay, so they start, singing these 4 Freshman arrangements, and I think that really, they were trying out probably several different styles, but it's Dennis, the middle Wilson brother, who was into and part of the surfing culture at the time, which was a kind of burgeoning at that time. And he was living the life, and he was absolutely, he was living the surfing life, and he came back one day to Brian, possibly Brian and Mike. Sometimes I hear the story as Dennis and Mike went surfing and came back, but I'll just say maybe Dennis.
Okay, yeah.
And so he basically said, "Hey, this is a new deal that's going on. You guys ought to write a song about this." And so Brian and Mike together came up with Surfin'.
Oh,
and so they had this little singing group together. And from what I understand, basically Carl on guitar there, and because actually I need to back up a little bit. So they get this Surfin' song together, right? The Murray and Audrey famously went on a business trip to Mexico in like September of 1961, and they were together rehearsing, having fun, whatever they were doing. And it was at that point that Al says that he suggested to go down and rent some instruments to up the music level of what they were doing. And because he had played the stand-up bass in a previous folk group that he played in, he said, "Well, we got to have a bass." Everybody asked me why not an electric bass at that point. Well, the electric bass was brand new, and it really hasn't. Most of the '50s rock and roll groups were still using stand-up basses, and even in the early '60s. And so people asked me why that choice was made. Well, it was obviously made because Al had already played it, maybe, but also because people weren't quite sure what to make of electric basses yet. It was just right at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So, but as an aside here, not much is ever told about how Al actually came to learn to play the guitar, let alone that upright bass. I play bass. I play both upright bass and electric bass. And, you have to have a little bit, especially on the upright with no frets and just being a great big thing.
Huge, yeah.
I want to know how he learned how to navigate that thing.
Yeah, I
right?
mean, I've watched you play the stand-up bass, and it looks like there's definitely some labor involved in it, right?
Well, yeah, and it's just maybe there was more common knowledge about the upright bass back then because of it being more of a commonly used instrument. And maybe maybe it's a stretch for me to say how did he do, but I still, man, I want to know.
Yeah.
I want to know. I kind of have an idea how the other guys kind of organically built themselves as musicians, but I want to know more about Al's story specifically, because I think there's some real important stuff at the beginning there. Anyway, they go down to rent these instruments. They rent that, and they rented some drums for Dennis because he didn't play anything. He literally taught himself how to play the drums after that. And he learned how to play backwards from what standard drummers do now, but it's just that's the epitome of how they just made it work. Whatever was going to work, and so they just had to make it go at that point. And so I think that was the basic thing of the renting the instruments, was to get the bass and the drums. And then they went home that weekend and started working on Surfin', and had some parties, and kids from around the neighborhood came. And actually, I think, maybe it's dramatized a little bit, but it's always kind of painted as Murray and Audrey come home from Mexico, and the house is a big party, and they're, and Murray gets, "What's happened to," Famously, it was said that they used the grocery money that he left them to rent the instruments, and that was Al said that grocery money was eaten before that plane had left the run. Before they went to Mexico, he said their mom had to loan them a significant amount of his mom, Al's mother, loaned them a significant amount of money to go down there and rent those instruments.
Okay,
but anyway, Murray and Audrey come home. They play them Surfin', and Murray, who had been in the recording industry and a songwriter himself and had lots of connections, he listened and said, "Wow, let's get that recorded."
So Murray hears them playing. So they're playing. So who's playing right now? So we got
it's Brian.
Brian.
And I don't know what they were playing when he heard them. I'm guessing because they rented that bass, and even though Dennis doesn't play drums on that first record, Brian plays a drum with his finger. I think that it probably was the bass and maybe Dennis on the drums and Carl on a guitar and maybe Brian on the piano. I'm
speculating right
speculating.
now. Okay.
What he heard was just them. He was impressed by the quality of the tune for, just,
being
kids
someone,
coming up, and said, wow, that's catchy. And a lot of people don't realize it, but he had more than just a little bit of modest success in the recording industry. And he already had some connections where he knew that he could help, find a place to get it recorded. And that's what he set out to do.
Okay, so Murray hears it, he likes it, he wants to help. He helps them record. So how far does he take that? What does he like? He just helps them actually physically record, or he helps them like what's the order here?
Right. No, he didn't help them actually. He wasn't involved in the recording so much as he had connections to recording studios, record producers, music publishers. At that time, that was a big thing attached to songwriting. And so he had all these, he knew he had probably several options of people he could get to just that had studios at that time, which was very primitive technology, 3-track at most. Mm-hmm. He knew that he could get them into one of those places to at least get the song recorded. Once you have the song recorded, that doesn't mean anything. It's just recorded.
Right.
So then what happened in their case, a man named Height Morgan, he and his wife, Height and Dorinda Morgan, had a company, and they recorded the first hit and a bunch of the early tunes in different sessions. But it was probably after the Surfin recording, I think that they decided, oh, hey, we'll help you shop this thing around. Once you get a tune recorded, it's, there's quite a process. Yeah, even back then, it's completely changed. But then you almost have to have a salesman take that thing around to record companies and play it for them, and you're going to get a lot of no's before you get yeses, right? And everybody knows this, and I'm not going to belabor people with like the whole story of that, but they finally did get a company and distributor to release the record in late 1961. And the cool quote that I hear from Al all the time is, they basically had a hit record because that record went to number 75 in the nation.
Wow. Okay.
And then they basically had to go, oh no, we better get a band together.
Yeah, because
it was just literally a couple months since they'd rented those instruments over in September, and then that record gets released, I think in November sometime, and then it got to 75 by early 62 or something like that. But it doesn't matter. I mean, that whole thing must have been pretty scary.
So when Al says that, is that because at this point they just have like one song? They just have the surf, or do they have more? Yeah, they have some more like kind of backlogged or whatever.
At the very beginning, they just had the one song. The B side of Surfin' is actually written by, I believe, Dorinda Morgan, or maybe their son Bruce, and kind of part of the price of admission to getting the song recorded was on the B side we want our song. So there's a song called Luau, and it's actually a cool little tune. But it's not a Beach Boys tune at all. It was the Morgans tune that they recorded for them, and it was part of the deal probably, right? Early on, okay, yeah, they'll let that A side be yours, and then we're going to do this. You're going to put one of our tunes on the other side.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
But I don't know how much Brian had written at that point anyway. But I do know that after the Surfin' record was a success in L.A. mainly, and then more largely in the U.S., that either Surfer Girl and Surfin' Safari 409 and a few of those bigger tunes were written along with some other ones that they recorded with the Morgans, but then they also went out and went to Western Recorders with a man named Chuck Britz and did a demo of, I know it's at least Surfin' Safari 409 and Surfer Girl. I can't remember what else is on there. Oh, it had a version of the Four Freshmen, an a cappella version of the Four Freshmen. Their Hearts Were Full of Spring on it. But that was the thing that Murray then started shopping to bigger record companies to try to get them a big record deal. Did I mention the name of the first record company?
No, I don't think you did.
Oh, so the first record label is Candix, I believe, Candix.
You definitely did not say that. So
that was the label that the first single was on, which was just a small independent deal in LA, right? And they knew immediately, after that went, that they were going to want to get something with a little bit more traction behind it. And I know that Murray went to a lot of places. Of course, Capitol, where they finally got the contract, but then also Liberty Records, I know for sure, and probably Decca or something. Probably all the big companies.
Yeah, he was doing kind of what you said, where he's going around and he's kind of trying to shop.
He's a salesman.
Totally.
Man. They used to have what they called acetates back then, which is like you get a record recorded. It'd be this equivalent of me working on a tune in the studio right now, and they just, hey, burn me a copy of what we've done today.
Okay.
So that I can take it home and listen to it, or maybe I can play it for some friends, get some feedback, or blah, 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 whatever like that. Well, they could do that, but what they did is they made actually they just printed a little record. They had a machine that could actually just, draw the grooves, so that's what, you'd go around with that little thing and take it around to record labels and have them listen to it and see if they wanted it. And
so Surfin' goes to number 75, you said?
Yes, it ended up hitting number 75 on the Billboard 100 charts.
Okay, so on this record that went to number 75, what's the instrumentation on that then?
That is crazy. It's Carl on what we believe to be his K acoustic electric guitar. There's several famous photos of it, well, not with Carl with it, but one of Brian's friends playing it at a school assembly. We believe it's that guitar, and it's not plugged in, which would account for the crazy tone that it has on there. Once somebody told me that, then I thought, oh, that makes all the sense in the world. But so it's that guitar with Carl, then just Al on the stand-up bass. And I don't know if Dennis was deemed not experienced yet enough, but Dennis is not playing the drums on the first record. It is Brian, and they just took a snare drum and they laid a jacket over it to muffle it a little bit. And Brian plays the snare drum with his finger, one finger.
And this is what went to 75?
Yes. That was their first record.
And is that what we hear right now when we listen to Surfin'?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Wow. That's what we hear when we hear Surfin'.
Crazy.
The original recording. Now, one thing about the original recording is that I know that the single was, and I know that it was actually the original recording of that was included on the Surfin' Safari album, but it doesn't fit. It was the only song that wasn't recorded at the Capitol Studios. It almost sounds like it's out of place on that record because it was done so primitively.
Oh, interesting.
Compared to the rest of the Surfin' Safari album was done with electric guitars and electric bass and the full, rather, regular kind of a garage band combo sort of a thing, right? This early record was just stand-up bass, a finger on a drum, and a 15-year-old kid playing an unplugged cheap guitar.
Wow. That's pretty wild. And that took him to 75, and still that's still a record that we hear today. That's pretty crazy.
Another really interesting point about the early years is it was not their idea to be called the Beach Boys.
Really?
Yeah. So famously on the first few albums, or the first on Surfin' Safari and Surfer Girl, all those things come from one photo shoot. They're wearing a shirt called a Pendleton shirt. They're made up in Pendleton, Oregon, and they were the cool thing that all the surfers wore for a warm shirt down on the beach. A nice wool shirt, and it just became a surfer's kind of uniform type of thing. And so early on, their uniforms weren't the striped shirts that they were famously a couple years later. they were wearing these Pendleton shirts. And there's a great video of them doing Surfin' Safari live in '62 wearing those Pendleton shirts, and it's been colorized.
Oh, cool.
But anyway, they came up with the name the Pendletones.
So they're the Pendletones
is what they wanted to be.
Interesting. Okay.
And that was it was a play on the shirt and then music, right?
Pendleton.
You know,
Yeah,
I get it, man. I dig it
That's
a
actually,
lot.
yeah,
And
I was gonna say, that's actually a cool name.
Oh man,
Yeah.
and I loved it, you know, but
So how do they get to the Beach Boys?
that's what they want to know. They literally, I think they opened the box that came to their house with the Surfin' single printed, you know, the done deal, and they opened the box and it says the Beach Boys.
And that's the first time they heard that they were
that was the first time that they knew, and it was an incredulous response, like, what the,
this isn't us. Yeah. Who's this?
And I'm sure it elicited a lot of kind of uncertain, you know, Dennis was the only real surfer in the group, and you know, I'm sure there had to be a lot of that. We don't want to be pretenders, you know, lots of stuff.
Sure.
They accepted it in the end, but it was a record company executive.
Welcome to the music business, I guess, huh?
That at one of the guys that was one of the distributors that was going to be distributing that record for Candix, that first one. And they said, what do they call them? And they just, whoever the executive was or executives were, they hated that Pendleton. They didn't understand, weren't hip enough, probably, right?
Right.
Weren't young kids. So that I think they originally wanted to say, let's call them the Surfers. And there was already a band, believe it or not, that you know, probably a flash in the pan that was already being called the Surfers, so they couldn't. And somebody said, just call them the Beach Boys.
Wow, don't even check with them. Just call them the Beach Boys.
That's how that, you know.
I mean, it worked out. Obviously,
it did, and I guess but. It's a really an early example of that type of marketing manipulation that went on, especially in those days. They didn't care about artists hardly at all in those days, especially young artists playing rock and roll music that they didn't have much respect for at all at that point.
So yeah, they didn't.
The record company executives
are
yes, yeah, and you're not gonna. Which Brian changed all that within a very short time.
Nice, very cool. So now we got the hit, we got the Beach Boys, the name. This is perfect. But now, so where we go from here? We have a hit. Does this give us the Beach Boys that we see today, or is this where do we go? What happens next?
Well, what happens next is they have to start doing appearances to support that record that they just released, and they didn't have a band.
Yeah,
really, and they were gonna be making the transition from acoustic instruments to more electric instruments. I think I don't know how much that has to do with the fact that Al, after the first record, and it's for a number of different reasons, he left for a while. He didn't know if it was going to pan out or not. You know, I'm sure he wanted to have something else to rely on. I think he went back to school a little bit. It was famously said he went to dentistry school. So I don't know how much there is to that, but suffice to say, he figured he might want to maybe do something else to fall back on, you know, or just didn't see the Beach Boy thing having the future that it had. So temporarily he kind of bowed out. And at that point they had a decision to make. And it's an interesting decision, but it worked out amazingly. The neighborhood kid that Carl had been playing guitar with lived right across the street, David Marks, a couple years younger than Carl. So even it's crazy. They asked him to be in the band, and he is playing on the first 4 or 5 albums for Capitol. David is playing. That young kid, all of them are playing on a lot of those first records, but it just floors me that not only was he asked to be in the band, most most people have the misconception that maybe the Beach Boys didn't play on their record and stuff like that. No, especially early, and even the 12-year-olds were being allowed to
play.
not and he was doing a dang good job. He wasn't 12 when he was older than that when they got to doing that, but it was 13, 14, something like that.
So how long is he filling in for Al? I mean, I think it's safe to say he's kind of filling in at
first he's
hindsight.
filling in for Al. That's what it looks like, right? Well, Brian, and a lot of people know this, he is a very, he's not a real extroverted guy and didn't really particularly care for the road to begin with. He famously left the road in the end of 1964, but there was a period in 1963, even early on, where he either had other things to do, was too busy, or he just didn't want to go. There were times when he wouldn't go out with them, and so the touring group at this time was Brian, Carl, Dennis, and Mike and Dave, right? Because Al had left, and they recruited Dave to come in and play rhythm guitar. Well, then Brian all of a sudden decides he doesn't want to go. Well, let's call Al. And they bring Al, who really wasn't officially back into the group till 64, right? Well, Al comes in when he would, I guess they thought in the beginning he was, even though he played upright bass, that he was going to play guitar because he knew something about the guitar. Anyway, it goes through the Dave thing. Now Dave's playing the guitar, but probably makes sense because Brian plays the bass. Now Al's playing bass on the road. Al is also called upon to sing Brian's falsetto parts that early in the game on the road with them in 63 when he's not officially in the band.
And why is he singing Brian's falsetto parts?
Because he was probably the guy that could. And that's what Brian sang on the road. He was the high voice to sing those parts on the road. And so Al has to come in and play the bass and sing those parts because Brian's not on the road with them anymore. Oh, he's not on the
road. Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So he's out there live, the songwriter and the mastermind behind the whole thing is kind of a tentative guy from the very get-go, and
sure,
kind of
okay.
letting that, you guys go do that part of it, I'll do this.
Right. Okay.
So you've got that happening, but you also have Al being recruited to come in, I think, for the Surfer Girl album in 1963, because Brian wants to play piano, add piano to the rhythm tracks, the basic tracks. And because technology was not at the point where they could do a lot of overdubbing at that point, still only 3-track technology most of the time, which means you have to get all the instruments on one track and do it live, basically. Okay. Uh-huh. So everybody's got to be playing together with no mistakes through a whole take.
Uh-huh. Wow. Yeah. That's...
And Brian wanted to add his piano to the rhythm, to the rhythm bed, and he does it in such a subtle way that most people don't even know that there's pianos on Catch a Wave and some of those other early Beach Boy tunes. But since he wanted to play piano, he recruited Al to come in and play bass on those records. And so Al's actually playing bass on a lot of the Surfer Girl album and the Little Deuce Coupe album after that, before he's officially back in the band.
Okay, so at this point, they have a record deal or they don't?
Oh, yes. I've gotten ahead of myself a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah,
it's okay. I mean, that Al component, Al Dave component, that's an interesting little aspect of what's going on. But I guess, take me back. Let's just rewind a little bit and go. So when does the actual record deal happen to where all these, Surfin' Safari, Surfin' USA, all that start to come out?
Right. Well, okay. Al leaves the group, and David is on the road with them, and David also goes in and makes the first demos at Western Recorders with them that's being shopped around. Murray's got that demo, and he goes around to all those record companies, like we said. And Capitol, he got persistent with them, and I know that he bugged the heck out of them, from all the stories I've heard. But there was one young producer over there named Nick Vinay that he got his ear and got him to listen to those records. And I don't know if it was Surfin' Safari or 409 he heard first, but it was very shortly. I mean, some stories are that he just ran right to his boss's office and says, "I've got a smash." Most people say no, it was a lot cooler than that. He said, "Yeah, I'll think about it, and you guys come back in an hour," sort of thing. Whoever, but anyway, out of that moment, and that happens sometime in early 1962.
Okay.
Then the Beach Boys get signed to Capitol Records. Man, I think it's in May or June or something like that. And Murray staged a photo op for them in their Pendleton shirts and ties, and they were all sitting around a table with Nick Venet acting as if they were signing, but there was all blank pieces of paper in front of them. It was just and I've heard stories where that wasn't done in those. That was all designed by Murray. He was a salesman and a marketing guy. He was looking forward to, how am I gonna legitimize these guys, or just whatever angles he was coming from, right?
Okay. Now, once that record deal happened, it's kind
of once that happened, and then the single Surfin' Safari and 409 double-sided. Surfin' Safari on one side, 409 on the other side, and it took off. I think it went to number 20 or something like that, or eventually, and that the success of that, I'm sure they said, okay, we want a whole album, which leads you to August '62 when they were recording the Surfin' Safari album, the first album.
Wow,
So less than a year of renting those instruments, September 1961, and Al leaving, David coming in, going out making demos, going out playing live shows, and less than a year they've got a major recording contract with Capitol Records.
Wow, and
then they really had to get to work.
but that essentially is how it all got started, right there. Then, right?
Yes,
I mean that's up until they get their first record deal. So.
Yep.
Cool. I mean, that answers my question. And then definitely, I think that'll do it for this episode.
Yeah, that was fun. I love talking about the Beach Boys.
Yeah. No, I could tell. I mean, I could tell, and you got the knowledge and can field my questions, so it's perfect.
Well,
if you guys like the episode, you like the podcast, please rate and review us in these first episodes. It really helps us get some traction to have some nice reviews and 5-star ratings. If you want to give us a 5-star. If you want to hop on YouTube and kind of see the In My Beach Boys Room set, we got some cool instruments behind Matthew here, and a couple behind me, I think, as well. So hop on our YouTube channel, which is just In My Beach Boys Room, or Matthew Hartz, and you can see all that stuff there. So we will see you next time. Thank you very much for listening.